Okay, everybody, we're going to go ahead and start this live video. A couple minutes to spare, see if anybody joins in real quick. Today we're gonna be talking about Japanese swordsmanship and the way it applies to the lightsaber. So I've got my lightsaber. We're gonna go over this a little bit more. I've also got my katana. It's a short katana because I'm in my basement here. I don't want to cut too much. So we're going to talk about the differences in styles. I've also grabbed one of my synthetic longswords. So we'll go over a little bit of that. But today's going to be mainly about Japanese sword and how it applies to the lightsaber. And kind of the whole Jedi thing as a whole. So most people that have in some way been fans of Star Wars understand that a lot of it came from the Japanese influence. There was a lot of the Japanese side of it that got brought into George Lucas's stuff. So mainly the movie The Hidden Fortress was basically the first Star Wars that he took and kind of turned it into a space fantasy type deal, which is a really good movie. It's Toshiro Mifune. It was Akira Kurosawa. It was a really good movie, but I'm a huge dork for the big samurai movies too. So any of those you could put in front of me and I'd be stuck for a couple hours at least. I'm kind of new to this Facebook Live thing too, so like I don't know if anybody's asking questions or anything, but I don't know how to see that. But anyhow, I'm sure a lot of you guys are probably going to watch this later. I know my schedule's kind of weird, so the only time I could do this is 10 o'clock on a Monday, which is probably when most other people are working, but my weekends are Sundays and Mondays. So any questions or whatever you guys have, just toss them out there, and myself or somebody else can answer them later on if we need to. But anyway, so we're going to go into some of the ways the weapons were used, and we're going to be talking about fantasy, guys. I mean, this is all like toys and play. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the real martial arts of Star Wars because there wasn't a lot of it. But as far as the way the weapons were used, it was actually very entertaining to watch it as somebody. So we'll start over. Let me start over here. Let me give you guys some of my history. So I've done martial arts for about 22 years now, and it's been a huge part of my life. And it all started when I was about 3 years old, and I watched this guy in black swinging a green lightsaber around on top of these floaty things in the desert. And I realized at that point, I'm going to learn how to fight with swords one day. This being a small child. I didn't get that opportunity until I was about 18. So I'll be 40 here in another month or so. And since I was 18, I've been playing with swords and fighting with them and doing all kinds of fun stuff. And the reason that I enjoy the TPLA program so much is because it's more like a laboratory than it is a theoretical bar. A lot of people in other arts like to sit around and talk about what could happen, and we at TPLA like to show how it does happen. And if you can make it work, then you've proven it. So anyway, all that said, I started my martial arts journey in 1998, and I'm still on that journey. I don't think I'll ever stop. And it all started when I was teeny tiny as a kid, watching some dude swing around a green lightsaber. So we're gonna walk through a lot of the basics that are applicable from our system into what I've learned for the last 22 years through the traditional martial arts that's been around for hundreds of years. So if you look at the way, of course, this is an omnidirectional fantasy blade. So technically anywhere can cut with this, right? It's not the way our normal stuff works. So when we hold the blade through the TPLA system and through Japanese swordsmanship, you hold the blade and you want the bones in your arm to line up with your cutting edge. So with this being a fantasy weapon, any part could cut, right, with very little effort. But we're trying to apply this in a way that's practical for us in modern day. So we want our striking edge to be lined up with the bones in our arms. Our standard in Japanese swordsmanship, Chudan Stance, which is a middle stance, we point the blade at our opponent. Very similar to Japanese swordsmanship. And again, that's not to say that the only thing you can use these for is Japanese swordsmanship. Our founding member, Chad, has lots of Chinese background. I know Anthony does as well, Filipino background. All that stuff can be applied. Nothing is to be said that only Japanese swordsmanship works with these guys. I'm not trying to say that. I'm just giving my background and how it applies to this stuff. So don't worry about all the extra stuff that goes on. This is just the way that I'm applying this to you. And if you guys, have any idea about the history of it, Lucas pulled a lot from Japanese history. So if you look at Vader's costume and all that stuff, it comes right out of Japanese armor and things like that. So again, there's only a certain amount of ways you can hit things with a weapon, and all the different styles of weapons have figured that out. So a lot of guys want to go, well, what about this? What? Doesn't matter. The blade hits the other guy, and that's the whole thing. Oh, there's some stuff popping up. Biomechanics. Again. Yep, you're right, Robert. You're correct. Is absolutely correct. Biomechanical alignment avoids injury, but it also increases your effectiveness and it creates efficiency. So if you do not line up biomechanically, as I was talking about with the bones behind your strike, all that stuff is going to take away your efficiency and it's going to create a less efficient swordsman. Which also applies, I'm going to put this guy down real quick. I'm going to grab the katana that I've got, which also applies. Now when I hold this, again, I want my bones in my arm to line up with the striking edge of the blade. Otherwise, the old katanas that were created years ago with poorer metals than we have nowadays would bend. If you struck something improperly and you did not create the hard edge that you're supposed to create through the strike, you would bend the blade and it would never come back. Nowadays, this one especially is impregnated with a lot of silicone, and spring steel. So I could bend it very far off of its line and it would still come back, which means it's good for beginners and it's good for people who make mistakes every now and then without having to purchase an entirely new weapon. Now, a lot of people think that the katana is like the lightsaber with regards to historical weaponry, and it's not. The Europeans actually had better steel than the Japanese had, which is why the Japanese would fold them over and over and over, because it pulled out the horrible parts of the steel. It pulled out the really bad things and elements that were in the steel. So that's why the Japanese sword was folded so many times. European swords were actually a little better made back then because they had better steel at their disposal. So, speaking of which, this guy probably can't even fit on camera. Yeah, so this is just a synthetic longsword. It's polycarbonate, really good for sparring. So yeah, and yes, Robert, you're right. Yeah, Mark Hamill did study Kendo for Return of the Jedi. So there's a rumor, I've never been able to find this, but apparently Vader's breathing came from Mark Hamill doing some Kendo doing doing Star Wars, and Lucas heard that and heard the heavy breathing through the Kendo mask, and that's when he decided that that's how Vader should sound. I don't know. It sounds like a cool story. It could be true. I have no idea. Anyway, so going back to the longsword here. So the longsword obviously is going to have two edges. You got the front edge and the back edge, which creates a lot of different technique than what you can have from a single-edged sword. Now, a curved sword is going to have a lot more. You're going to be able to bite through your opponents a lot more. It's going to have a lot more penetration because the striking edge is going to be smaller than something flat like this. A flat sword is going to hit with more edge, which means it's not going to penetrate as far as something curved. So a single-bladed curved sword, whether it's one-handed or two-handed, a cutlass, a Chinese dada, all these other weapons, katana, whatever, are going to be a little bit more effective for a beginner than a flat blade. Now again, bringing all this back to this fantasy weapon, the lightsaber, doesn't really matter because the lightsaber can cut in every direction. So again, it's one of those odd things that we like to look at and think it's really cool and it's very neat, but it's down to really this is just a fantasy weapon. We're having fun with it and we're learning standard styles, but we also have to keep in mind that this is an analog to a real weapon, and the real weapons have rules that physics has to follow, and you can't cut on every direction of a longsword or a katana or any other weapon. At that point, it becomes a blunt instrument when you don't hit it with the edge. So that's just one thing which is equivalent to this thing, which again can hurt people, which is why we have safety gear, etc., etc. And we're not going to go into too much of that today. But the safety gear is important because this is still a weapon, much like an eskrima stick or any other blunted, a Vulcan, anything that's blunted can do damage. It just won't sever limbs like they do a lot in Star Wars. So I see, somebody, Alexander, yep, you're from France. Hi, from France. So yeah, we study these things with the intention of having fun and also studying what is real in the world and the way that the world works with regards to the weapons. So we've gone through the hold. The hold is, again, you want your hands far apart. You're going to watch a lot of movies and they're going to hold it like a baseball bat. And they're going to swing like crazy. The reason our hands are separate is because you want there to be a levering action. Okay, so I'm pulling with this hand as I'm pushing with this hand, which creates a lot more force versus holding it with two hands and just swinging like a baseball bat. Okay, so you want to hold it two-handed in this direction and swing with a push-pull motion. Okay, whether that's like Anthony was talking about with his other video, whether that's along this line, this line, this line, this line, here, and a thrust. The thrust works the same way. You're pushing with both hands, pulling with one, pushing with the other. Okay, so all that, again, it's not just Japanese. I'm just talking about what I have the most experience in, which is Japanese swordsmanship. So all of that to be said, that's the way you want to strike with a weapon. It's the way that even with bow staffs and larger weapons, you never see a bow staff being held with their hands together like this. They're always going to have it separated so that there's a ratcheting push-pull motion. Okay? All right, so we're going to talk about some footwork too. We look at the footwork in TPLA's curriculum versus the footwork in samurai swordsmanship. There's not a lot of talk about the footwork through traditional Japanese swordsmanship. I wasn't really taught a system when I learned. It was kind of a very each person moves their own way sort of system. but there were certain rules that just kind of applied. And one of those is you tend to want to point your toes, your front toes at least, at your attacker. Now, again, I've done some HEMA, I've done some fencing, and I know that sometimes that doesn't apply. Sometimes you're going to want to point your toes in a different direction. There's always an exception to the rule. This was just the general rule that we would go into in samurai swordsmanship. Is you typically wanted to point your toes in the direction of the person that you're going to be striking or the thing that you're going to be attacking. So whether you're doing tamashigiri, cutting milk jugs, or sparring in Kendo, you tended to point your front toes towards those people. Now, Kendo, I'm not going to get into a lot of Kendo. Kendo has become its own sport, kind of like sport fencing has become its own sport. The Kendo that I was trained in was pre-war Kendo. So there was grappling, there was punching, kicking, a lot of things like that. So we didn't really get into all of the rules that occurred based around how you scored points. We didn't really care about points. We looked at it as you get hit one time and it's over, because that's the way it would have worked had there been no armor and no bamboo swords. So yeah, the footwork in what we do as a Japanese art is a little bit more of a it's kind of each individual person's way of doing it, other than the basic rules, which is, again, you want about 60% on your front foot, 40% on your back foot, and then that's going to shift depending on whether you're striking, parrying, moving, etc. And the thing I'm going to cover in 2 weeks, I'm going to do another one of these videos, and hopefully I'll have this figured out by then. I'm kind of trying to get it. Anyway, in a couple weeks, I'm going to do one on timing and distance, which it doesn't matter what sword style you practice, whether you do rapier, longsword, samurai sword, it doesn't matter. Regardless of all that stuff, if you have your timing and distance down, it doesn't really matter. You're gonna prevail over the other person, because that's what matters the most. And this comes down to hand-to-hand fighting as well. Boxing, you watch some of the really good boxers, the people that had the best timing and distance, they knew that they could move slightly back and they were out of threat, and slightly forward and they could become a threat. So same thing happens with the sword. The difference is we don't walk around with something this long in our hands every day. If I sit at my desk, I know when I can reach a stapler, I know when I can touch my keyboard, I know when I can do, and I've just got to move my body slightly because we're aware of everything we have on a daily basis. We don't carry around something this long on a daily basis and walk around with it in our hands. So I'm going to cover that here in a couple of weeks. But today we're going to look at the Japanese sword and the lightsaber. So anybody have any questions? I don't really have a whole lot more to go over other than nothing else right now. Again, the footwork stuff is going to come into play a lot more with the timing and the distance. And a lot of the footwork is really funny because you'll see the same stuff happening in HEMA that happens in Kendo, Eskrima, Chinese sword. I mean, all this stuff tends to have the same basic footwork because, again, what's the goal? Touch the sword to the other person. That's the goal, right? So you get your sword to touch them, you win. A lot of fights back in feudal Japan were over at first contact, and they didn't end in these huge bloody, he severed my hand, and et cetera, et cetera. A lot of it was literally, oh God, that guy got hit, and there's no surgeons around to reattach tendons, so we quit. And that's kind of the way that a lot of the fights used to go in feudal Japan. As far as looking into the lightsaber, they didn't, it's kind of interesting, in all of the Lucas movies, they didn't treat these things as well as the samurai did. The samurai looked at their sword as it embodied their soul. So their soul was existing inside of their sword. There was a lot more respect to it, and I think that probably had a lot to do with the fact that you couldn't just get some dude to make you another one next week. Nowadays, with the invention of the Amazon and all of the things that are online, you can just, oh man, I broke this and I'm going to order a new one. I think that kind of has been portrayed through the Star Wars movies. I mean, you see a lot of them lose their lightsaber, and they don't freak out about it. They just get another one or whatever. So there wasn't a lot of that was portrayed throughout the movies. I mean, I know that in the new ones, they found these old lightsabers, and they had this like memory thing that was applied to, and people have said the same thing about old samurai swords. Again, I mean, it's one of those things that they slightly brought in, but the flippancy with which a lot of the movies treated the lightsaber was kind of interesting, because coming from the samurai swordsmanship side, you'd think that they would put a lot more of the soul into it, or some sort of spiritual aspect to it. Coming from a Jedi that can do things with their mind, they didn't really put a lot of that in the movies, which was kind of interesting. But anyway, so one thing I do want to talk about, I see it a lot. We talked about the way you hold a sword. So you'll hold the sword in this manner. Even when you're holding it one-handed, in Japanese swordsmanship, you would never grip the sword in such a way that you broke the wrist. Okay, so in Japanese swordsmanship, when you cut, unless you were swinging through or blocking to strike something else, you would not break the wrist unless it was a continuing movement. It was never an end movement. Reason being is that this position of the hand, which is basically the same position as a fist, what you would do a push-up with, what you would do a bench press with, this position is much stronger than this position. So you would want to keep your hand in this position. Now, if I got to point my sword at somebody, I'm going to point it at them with my wrist in an unbroken position. I don't want to break that wrist, because now it's much easier for me to lose that sword. And that's the last thing I want to do if I'm fighting other people, right? So the second thing I want to talk about that I see a lot about is the reverse grip. Now, the reverse grip looks really cool, and there are certain uses for it. There are some samurai kata in which you would reverse your grip and stab behind you, but quickly bring it back to a forward grip. The reverse grip is horrible for fighting. Horrible for fighting. It's got its uses for certain strikes and in certain moments. But I cannot stand watching people spar in a reverse grip. I'm just going to say it. It's ridiculous. It's terrible. It's better for a staff. But, again, if it makes it into a manual or a book, that means somebody did it at some point. I was having a discussion with one of my students last night about The Witcher and how he wears his sword on the back. And people were arguing that you shouldn't wear the sword on your back because it says so in manuals. Well, guess what, guys? If it's in a manual, somebody was doing it. It's like warning labels. If somebody didn't do it, they wouldn't put it on a warning label. Same thing with wearing your sword on the back. Same thing with the reverse grip. So somebody was doing it at some point. Again, I'm not saying it doesn't have its uses. There's, again, a lot of Japanese kata in which you would reverse the grip, stabbing behind you, cutting back through, and then immediately returning back to a forward grip. There's not a lot of the swinging it like this, especially with a blade that it just, your bones don't work that way, your muscles don't work that way. So I'm off my soapbox on that. So that's why we like to hold our sword the way they're supposed to be held. Stabs and spears, that's a whole different ballgame when you're fighting like this. But traditionally and typically, most of these are going to actually be used in a forward grip position, not a reverse grip position. So again, getting off my soapbox on that, I don't enjoy seeing a lot of those videos because they make no sense to me. The people that have been successful in sparring with other people in that position have typically sparred with people who aren't skilled. Anybody who's got a couple of years under their belt in any kind of weapon is going to dismantle the hell out of somebody who's reverse sparring. So anyway, all right, going back to the sword being held in position, I want my feet to be, again, decently separate. Depends on what I'm wanting to do, how I'm wanting to move. But footwork, again, we'll do a lot more on the footwork in 2 weeks when I cover the timing and distance, because obviously your feet are the biggest thing that applies to timing, distance, etc. But for people who are just now tuning in, watching, you want about 60% on the front foot, about 40% on the back foot, so you notice I can move myself quite a bit just based on that percentage of weight. I'm gonna have my hands separate. I don't like to wrap my pinky under the bottom. I see a lot of people that like to do this, but that takes off your ability to strike with the butt of the blade, whether it's long sword or whatever. I like to get my hand just to the end and just halfway wrap my pinky around. I don't know if you guys can see that. I just like to know I'm at the very end of the weapon. I don't like to, again, that can cause your pinky to get smashed if you butt somebody. But just at the end, I like my pinky halfway off the end. Again, this isn't a Japanese sword rule. This is just something that I've picked up and the way I like to do it. And none of the people that have done this more than me have ever told me it's wrong. So anyway, and it works. All right, so again, here's our stance. So from here, we can block and strike. We can block and strike. We can strike and block. All of these positions come from here. Now, what I like to tell my students is you don't want your elbows completely locked into your side because then you completely lose movement. But everything moves as a whole. I don't move my arms without moving my body. My arms might move, but my body's going to move as well, right? So when I move my arms, everything else moves. When I started some HEMA, it was weird because sometimes you would move your sword without moving your feet. And in Japanese swordsmanship, you always moved your feet when you struck. It was super weird. But it's because of the difference in their weapons. With HEMA, you could cut with both sides of the blade. With samurai swordsmanship, there's only one side that's going to be useful. So it was really easy for a HEMA practitioner to be able to strike and block and strike without moving their feet. But it's got a lot more body rotation and a lot more body movement in it. So again, coming back to the samurai sword, and the way this works, anything you can do from this position. There's low guards and there's high guards, right? And typically, when I started, I used to think of those as very static holds, and I learned that they're not. A lot of them, if I miss a cut and stop, well, now I'm in a low guard. I don't have to bring this back up unless I want to, but I've cut, I'm in a low guard. Say I strike up and I miss, and now I'm in a high guard. But I've kept myself mobile. The whole point of it is to be completely fluid with anything you do. You start acting like a rock'em sock'em robot, and you're going to get tagged. You're going to get hit, and things aren't going to go the way you want, regardless of the style. Okay? So, I've not really brought this up about the styles of the lightsaber that we've kind of invented and made names for. And essentially, you'll look at them, and each one's going to have its own little style that it pulls into, whether it's the Shicho or the Makashi or the Surisu or whatever you want to look at. I remember a question asked to me when I first started my training through the TPLA guys. They said, which style do you want to move to? Like once you learn it. And I said, Chicho, I love the simplicity and the straightforwardness of the first style that we've done through the program. So, you know, you can get into the really cool stuff and the, you know, these sort of flippy things and stuff you can do and spinny stuff, and that's cool and it's really good. Again, a lot of samurai styles have the spinny stuff. You know, we see the spin that we use a lot of times here in a lot of our movements. Well, that's a block. As somebody comes in with a strike, that's a block as you bring your sword back in, and it works the same on the other side. Now, if I keep spinning, that's just to look cool, right? But that spin, whether it's done on one side or the other, two-handed or one-handed, is straight out of Japanese swordsmanship, and it's in numerous katas that a lot of people, you know, think looks really cool, and when you light up a sword, it looks way cooler than when I spin the one that's not lit. If I have this one and just spin it, it does not look nearly as cool as a blade that's lit up. So, yes, it looks a little flashier. It looks a little more over the top, but that's the point of the lightsaber. The lightsaber is there to be over the top. It's there to be a fantasy weapon. And again, you know, we're going to all keep tying in a lot of these analog weapons to these weapons because it gives it a lot more purpose other than just a big glowy stick that we wave around. So to wrap everything up and kind of give everybody something to think about, as you're training with your glowy toy sword thing, think about the purpose with which you're training. So think about your edge that you're going to be striking with a real sword. Think about what you're blocking with as you strike. Train with purpose. And again, I know that this is a really weird time to be doing all this, and if there's any questions that anybody watches later and they have, just send them my way, send them to TPLA's page. Somebody will gladly answer them. So thanks for watching, guys. And we'll see you in a couple weeks. I'll do some timing and footwork stuff, and hopefully I'll have this whole live thing figured out by then. Anyway, keep sabering. May the force be with you all.